Hello and welcome to the Phil Hay Show, which is brought to you by The Athletic and The Square Ball. At the Phil Hay Show is the Twitter account if you want to pop on there and say hi. I'm Dan Moylan and joined from the Square Ball by Michael Normanton.
Hello.
And the man with his name on the show, here's Phil Hay.
Hello.
For better or for worse, the football season is back and you can subscribe to The Athletic right now to read everything that Phil has written, will write, and everything in between. The Premier League and a host of other sports, and 33% off is the offer at the minute if you head to theathletic.com/Leeds pod. This week, Phil?
There's an Old Trafford post-mortem, if you can stand it. We have had a chat, Amitai Winehouse and I, about the best 11. Also, a little look at why it is that Calvin Phillips, his position and what he does is so rare and difficult to replicate. And we've got quite a funny piece towards the back end of this week about how clubs sell a footballer when they decide they want to get rid.
Theathletic.com/Leeds pod for that. And I guess the conversation can flow naturally into Calvin Phillips, actually. And the thing that was missing, the glaring thing that was missing in the deep line midfield role was, well, marking.
Ouch. Twice in 2 years. And I think on reflection, I don't feel a huge amount better about Saturday than I did about the beating they took over at Old Trafford last season either. We've just come off Bielsa's press conference, and we'll get into more of the wider issues further down the line in this edition. But he obviously blamed himself, because he always blames himself when it goes wrong like that. But I thought it was quite telling that he said that up until the point where Leeds equalised, they deserved to be behind. He didn't feel that they'd had enough of the game or been competitive enough in it. To be level at 0-0 or to have parity with Manchester United. And I kind of felt the same. It had been better than last season, but it couldn't have been much worse, because obviously they were 2-0 down inside about 4 minutes and 4-0 down by the half-hour mark. This time round, it was tighter. It certainly felt a little bit more competitive. But I felt that up until the first goal, and either side of it too, you were seeing some of the things that had been a problem a year earlier or back in December, which was Solskjaer's midfielders running off Bielsa's, getting into space, Pogba able to pull the strings, Fernandes causing havoc in gaps and looking like he was going to score constantly, which in the end he did. And it was strange, because at 1-0, suddenly there was just that shift of momentum and shift of impetus. But I felt as if Leeds weren't able to plug in quickly after that and weren't able to switch on. And all of a sudden the game was gone. Bielsa said there was a point at 1-0 where he could see 5 of his players surrounding one Manchester United defender, and it was the sort of situation where he expected his side to create some problems and create some danger, potentially create a good chance. And then suddenly the ball was up the other end of the field. Greenwood was going past Struijk, and it was 2-1. So I think he saw in that instance a little moment where they might have been able to squeeze the game, to turn the screw and actually make something of it. But in no way was he pretending that they deserved anything from it over 90 minutes, and I certainly wasn't afterwards either.
I'm fairly sure we said in the wake of the defeat last year, or maybe for the return game at Elland Road, that you'd hope to see progress when it came to this fixture for this season. Doesn't really feel like we've made much, and I know Bielsa's taken it on his shoulders as he always does. Is this the problem with Marcelo Bielsa? And I'm loath to go in on him, because I love him more than most people. But it is on him, this one, isn't it? He didn't get it right, and by sticking so rigidly to the idea that you have to have X amount of minutes in pre-season, and he might be right, I should add, he might be right, but it's still resulted in this, hasn't it? Whether it's the pre-season minutes or enough practice or certain output stats, whatever it may be, he's just loath to put, say, Phillips in, when I feel like even a slightly under par Phillips might have been better than Koch positionally anyway.
If you watched Fernandes running off Koch, and if you watched the rotation between Fernandes and Pogba was all over the place. And 2 things you'd say about him. Firstly, not marked tightly enough, but secondly, showing why he's a World Cup winner. He did look fantastic, and he's got a similar sort of thing to Phillips, where he seems to constantly move at kind of not full sprinting pace. He just seems to be gliding around the place, and it's very difficult to contain when he's like that. But if you look at the movement, it was pretty much identical to a lot of what was going on last season. And the one thing I will say with Bielsa is that he is consistent about this. He doesn't flip-flop between players have to be perfectly prepared and then, on other weeks makes concessions and kind of contradicts what he said previously. But I did feel with Phillips, particularly was because he was on the bench, that it was a bit of a liberty going there and not playing him in the centre of midfield, defensive midfield, against a side who are going to be loaded with Greenwood and Pogba and Fernandes, they were always going to cause trouble, Manchester United. And I didn't expect Leeds to win there. I think Michael and I both said last week we thought it would probably be a home win, all things being equal. But because of that, you have to go there and be defensively sound. That's the kind of first priority for Leeds. I know they don't play like that under Bielsa, but the second game at Elland Road last season, it was more defensively tight. Phillips had a very good game against Fernandes and others in the midfield. And I did think it was a mistake. And you said, it's on him. That was our headline after the game. I felt it was down to the team that had been chosen. I think it comes back to that age-old argument, and I was saying in the intro that we've written about this week, that it is so difficult to replace Phillips. I almost feel like we've gone from the conversation about how do you replace him to a conversation about the fact that you can't really, because of the extreme level of quality that he shows in that area. It's really difficult to replicate that. And yeah, I think you have to say that away at Old Trafford, minus him, it did significantly weaken the team.
Thought experiment for you both. Imagine in 12 months' time, we go to Old Trafford, Bielsa's still the manager, we ship another 5 goals, and there's been a similar cause for it. Let's say, players being left out for whatever reason. How would you react to that? Same set of circumstances, but 12 months on.
I think it'd depend a lot on other things going on around it as well, because we followed it up last time with a couple of wins, and it felt like we got back on track fairly quickly. It was definitely harder to take this time, I think, was the thing. And it felt like having almost fixed what went wrong at Old Trafford when we got to Elland Road, to then go back to watch it all unravel again, it was kind of difficult. I mean, we do seem a bit prone to this. If we're going to criticise Bielsa for anything, it's that occasionally games just completely get away from us in quite quick spaces of time sometimes. The Derby playoff one being a famous example of it, but like Arsenal last year, who were not a good side, but that was similar. They just absolutely took us apart in a very short period of time. And even you go back to the start of last season, like Fulham, when we were cruising in that game, and all of a sudden they were back in it. And it did feel we have little spells where it feels like we can completely lose our heads for sometimes 10, sometimes 20 minutes. And if you're playing against a really high quality team, they can, in that time, put 4 goals past you. And I think that was the difficulty on the weekend. With Calvin Phillips in, I think it is a different game. Well, I still don't think we win, but I think it's maybe 4-2, or it's just a more respectable scoreline, and it's not quite as hideous to watch. Because it was that period after our goal, it was tough going. It was kind of peeking through your fingers like, oh, they're going to score 10 here if we don't stop something. So it does need addressing, and whether you do that with better personnel or just making Robin Koch better in that position, I'm not sure.
I mean, thankfully it doesn't happen too often, but why does that happen, Phil?
Well, just to go back to what you asked previously, I remember saying after the game at Old Trafford that I was pleasantly surprised by how reasonable people were about the 6-2 defeat. And it was almost as if everybody understood that those kind of results had to happen in the Premier League because of the way they played. It was going to happen, and it just so happened that it occurred at Old Trafford, the one place where you wouldn't want that to go on. But afterwards I said I don't see people being tolerant of that in Season 2, Season 3, Season 4. Having said that, if it falls in amongst the spell of results that make you finish 9th or top half, they're kind of isolated niggles, aren't they? And they're not satisfying, and you're not going to be happy about them. But they don't point to a bigger picture, which is concerning. But also, when we were talking to him about transfers today, he said one of the reasons that I think you're asking about this so much is because we've lost the big game 5-1, and that creates uncertainty. That creates anxiety, and it generates these type of questions. Do you need more? Do you need better players? Should you be recruiting more heavily? I certainly think that's true, and it's true because it's game 1 of the season, and it begs the question of what's coming next. And obviously you can't predict that, and you would like almost to skip on to October and see that they've won 5 or 6 games and are sitting really pretty. And it's no different to the paranoia that's there before the start of every season. But it's not a good start. It's not a good start. It's a bad start against, admittedly, a very strong and heavily loaded team, expensive squad. And I think they will be strong this season, Manchester United. But yeah, why does it happen? I think it happens because they are so tightly drilled, Leeds, and everything needs to be so spot on, particularly because you're talking about a lot of players who are constantly elevating themselves beyond the level they've been at previously. When it doesn't work and when it dips, it is inclined to drop to bits. And Bielsa was saying, the 3 aspects that were problematic for him were the fact that Manchester United were able to pass too easily to their forwards, the fact that Leeds were allowing turnovers in really dangerous areas, and the fact that defensively they just didn't have the structure that they should have done. He said that was his fault, and I think in terms of team selection it wasn't right. But there were also a hell of a lot of players who did not play very well on the day. It was a bad afternoon all round.
I feel like there's a bit of Leeds United exceptionalism in it as well, in that if Burnley or Southampton lose by 4 at Old Trafford, it doesn't seem to stand out that much as a shocking result. You wouldn't be surprised to see it, would you? And I suppose it's a reality check in a way of where we are and how big that gulf is between a team that's spending, £12 million in a summer and a team that's bringing on a £73 million substitute. Which isn't to excuse it, but I think it's almost like these things can happen when there are these massive disparities in the budgets.
Bielsa also suffers from the amount of attention that's on him and the amount of praise that he gets. There was a certain columnist in the Mirror this week who went in very heavily on him, two-footed, and I'm not sure that happens too, like you say, necessarily Hasenhüttl after day one of the season or Sean Dyche after day one of the season. Perhaps it does, I don't know, and perhaps... Well, I don't think there's any perhaps about it. Criticism of Leeds and Bielsa after that game was absolutely justified. You can't have the kind of avalanche of adulation that Bielsa gets without being questioned, from time to time when it goes wrong. But I do think that the scrutiny of him becomes more severe and is harsher when results go wrong and go badly wrong because of the reputation he has for being exceptional and for having made such a huge difference in these parts. I still feel that when it comes to the team and the squad, though, that they can play so much better than they did at Old Trafford, and I think they will also come up against teams who are considerably worse. And it does need to be seen with that perspective.
I think from a fan perspective, though, as Michael just touched on there, it was a harsh, unwanted reminder of exactly where we are, and we'd started to dream off the back of a good end to last season. With that unbeaten sequence of games, and it feels like it just completely knocked the wind out of our sails when we went into this season. The data set, as we said last week, fans based mood on data set, and now all we've got is a one-game data set where we got thumped. So that's what creates that angsty feeling, doesn't it? And to hear that we're not going to get anybody in the transfer market, I don't want to be negative about it, but that does fill me a little bit with anxiety.
It does concern me as well, the idea that another centre mid won't come in, because I do think that they need a bit more depth in that position. And that, the club have made that admission themselves by the fact that they tried to get Conor Gallagher, and they have looked very closely at Lewis O'Brien at Huddersfield. But Bielsa was talking today and saying that the standard of player that we want, we can't afford. We don't have the money to get the players who would make us better. And I don't think that was a dig, and I don't think he was saying that there's no money at Leeds. But he said that even low prices these days are high prices. And he said I thought he said that the price for new players, for good players who make them better, was excessive. It might have been inaccessible. It was a little bit difficult to tell over the Zoom. But one way or the other, he was making the point that they weren't prepared to go to the level that they were at. And that certainly ties in with the Lewis O'Brien deal, because that's been spoken about for a good few weeks now. And Huddersfield want around about £8 million, £8 to £10 million, a lot of the money up front. Leeds haven't been prepared to pay that and don't think the valuation is right. And I think that is kind of what Bielsa's saying. The players that we're looking at, even if you think £8 million is a small amount of money for a Premier League club, if that is not your valuation for him, then you're probably not going to do it unless you suddenly feel the urge that you have to because of results or because of depth or whatever else. And he kind of said, he said it's not as if the club haven't invested. They have invested. But at the same time, my point of view on this is that it does feel like it exposes them to the risk of injuries and other things. And I would feel far more confident with this squad. I don't think there need to be 3 or 4 players added to this, but a midfielder added. I can see the argument for a winger as well, because I don't feel that there's a huge output coming from Helder Costa. But in terms of the centre of midfield, until I think you can feel confident about relying on Forshaw, another body in there would definitely be an advantage.
And it does run counter to what Angus Kinnear told us 2 weeks ago, the money aspect of it, when he's saying like money's not a problem. Well, Bielsa says differently now. That's point number one. Point number 2 is, if they don't get a central midfielder in this window, that's 2 summer windows where they failed to do it. And I start to ask questions about that because they evidently need somebody in there and they've been trying to get someone. So the problem sounds like they're shopping out of their league.
I think what Kinnear would have been meaning was that they're not skint. They're not at the point where they have absolutely no cash. But clearly, if they want players of... I mean, you saw them linked with Nandes right the way through the summer, and it never really felt like there was too much in that at all. But the asking price for Nandes over in Italy seemed to be 30 to 35 million pounds, and I can totally understand that Leeds do not have the money to do that. I don't know if you think it's reasonable that they should have the money to do it. I kind of feel like the windows are going to have to be staggered, unless you have kind of untold investment and untold wealth. The windows are going to have to be staggered in the sense of how much gets spent. But you're right. I mean, I don't think the absence of another central midfielder was a massive problem last season. A lot of people said to me last season we need another centre forward as well, and in the end they didn't. You know, they were fine with that. But I think again, it might well be that we get to the end of this season and it hasn't been an issue. But at the moment, it feels like it could be. And I think that's the problem, isn't it? It feels as if to address that position with a player that Bielsa wants and will accept, bearing in mind that there are a lot of players that he wouldn't accept. If you could do that, it does feel like they would be set better than they are.
I think from my perspective, I understand there's not a bottomless pot of cash. But on the other hand, what you're saying there, Phil, they're exposing themselves to a risk by not recruiting somebody for the midfield.
I think that's the thing. It's all fine if Calvin Phillips can stay fit all season and if Stuart Dallas stays fit, because he has to cover a few positions as it stands, because we don't really have much cover in left back. But if those two were to be out for even 2-3 months, I think we could be looking at quite a tough period, particularly when we come up against the teams at the top end who you can really exploit the gaps there that Phillips leaves. So it does feel a risk. And as Dan said, we clearly wanted Cuisance at this point last year, and there's been nothing since then, has there? So
it's also form. I mean, it's not just fitness; it's form as well. You know, it's relying on the idea that the form of players is going to hold at a steady level all the way through the season, which to a large extent it did last season. But no, I agree. I think it is a risk in as much as I think it is something that could stop them moving forward this season. I definitely feel that. Whether it's a risk that puts them in any jeopardy, I don't feel that negative about it. But given that they were after a centre mid themselves, it goes without saying that one would have been useful.
Is there anything coming from within the club about Forshaw and Bate? Obviously, Forshaw made it onto the bench again at the weekend, and has played some under-23s games. But is there any chance of either of them establishing themselves?
Forshaw is doing well. He's played in the 23s. He was on the bench at Old Trafford. He's had a good summer and is picking up. Bielsa spoke about him today and had quite a lot to say. Firstly, to say that it's still difficult to rely on Forshaw because he's been out for so long, and that's kind of going to be the narrative around him until the point where he is actually playing regularly or available regularly, where he feels properly involved. He did say as well that we've touched on this previously, that he felt back in his first summer that Forshaw was arguably his best player, and he still feels that Forshaw is a player who, at full tilt, Leeds probably wouldn't be able to buy in the market because he'd be too coveted, and whoever had him would want to keep him. So I think in his head, he feels that if Forshaw gets to the stage where he is 100% fit and 100% up to speed and ready, then he's going to have a top player on his hands. But I don't think he's trying to deny that at the moment that they're still a little bit away from that. Lewis Bate, I mean, my understanding with Bate, really talented under 23 though he is, was that he was going to be a 23 signing and he was going to go into this emerging talent group, which is between the first team squad and the academy squad. But I certainly don't think the plan was for Lewis Bate to be heavily involved in this season.
At what point do they just pull the trigger on O'Brien at Huddersfield? Because 8 million, it's 8 million quid. I don't have 8 million quid, but for a football club, and payments been split over a couple of years, it's not a huge amount of money, is it? So why don't
I don't think it is, no.
Why don't they just get this done?
Good question. Given that it must be there to be done, it's been a strange one, because I assumed with Conor Gallagher that they'd have a very strong chance, and with him, and that's the one that's kind of skewed the window slightly, because he was first choice midfielder they were after. He was the one that I think they were very confident of getting, or very hopeful if Chelsea decided to loan him out. And then in the end it was Palace for him. And when they switched to O'Brien, I assumed that if if they were dead set on him, it would be quite straightforward to do. You know, that wouldn't be too complicated. But clearly there's something in the negotiations over terms or the finance. I just don't think Leeds think that he is a £8 to £10 million player, but I understand where you're coming from. There does come a stage in windows where clubs quite often think whatever we're being asked for, or within reason, perhaps we just have to push the boat out.
What of Poveda? Because he seems to be nowhere at the minute. There's talk, rumblings of things not being all sweetness and light with Marcelo Bielsa and him. Is there any intel on that you can give us?
Niall Huggins looks like, as we speak, he's going to Sunderland. So even though he broke through at Arsenal last season and looked very, very good, Bielsa's feeling from what he said today is that he has Ayling there, he has Shackleton who can play right back, he has Dallas who could play right back as well, and that if push came to shove, they would all start ahead of Huggins. So that in order not to hold Huggins back, he is leaving. He was asked if it's the same with Poveda, and there wasn't really a huge amount of clarity given. He kind of said that Poveda had been challenging on the first team front. He didn't seem to indicate that Poveda would be following Huggins out the door or necessarily rapidly, but it doesn't feel like Poveda is in the mix. And there has been some talk about a loan deal for Poveda. He certainly seems to have fallen behind Somerville in the pecking order, which in fairness is quite often how it happens in the academy. You know, you have players who come and go, and we've seen it with like Robbie Gotts and others, that 1 minute you're kind of front of the queue, then you slip a little bit further back. I remember them talking really positive terms about Stuart McKinstry at the start of last season. Haven't really seen him close to the first team squad for a little while. But it is a surprise with Poveda. He's a really talented player, and he was somebody who kind of consistently was coming off the bench and making a difference in games. But yeah, nowhere to be seen at this stage. And as I say, it does seem like he's dropped down the order.
So not a great week one in the Premier League, but other teams lost, as they do. That's how it works. The old game of football. So no need to panic just yet, even if things don't feel great after a 5-1 pasting at Old Trafford.
It was never going to feel great after a 5-1 pasting, and I did come away thinking this is going to certainly be one of those weeks where it's a little bit tense and it's a bit fractious. And I wouldn't criticise anybody for that. I think, as I say, it is a kind of natural reaction to a few quiet weeks in the window followed by a really heavy defeat over there. I think what Leeds would have been hoping for, and certainly what all of us were hoping for, was that you go to Old Trafford, you're really competitive, you look good, and you're left feeling, the plan's obviously in hand, it's under control. You are more inclined when you come away from a game like that to think, is this okay? Is this going to be okay? They need to play an awful lot better against Everton, and I think from Bielsa's comments today, I think he certainly understands that. He was saying, that you cannot lose like that over at Old Trafford and not accept that people are going to be very unhappy about it.
The Premier League is back, and The Athletic is home to the biggest football podcast network in the world. My podcast with Mark Chapman is becoming The Athletic Football Podcast, and there'll be 3 shows a week on that feed. Then there's the usual Totally Football show with James Richardson, Raphael Honigstein, James Horncastle and the gang. We also have a range of dedicated club shows featuring the likes of James Pearce, Amy Lawrence and Phil Hay. Check them out for all the latest transfer news and updates from your team. Michael Cox and Tom Warville will showcase their unrivaled analytics knowledge on the Athletic Tactics podcast, while Adam Hurrey's hilarious football cliches is now going twice a week. You've got all things WSL on the Athletic Women's Football podcast. Take your fantasy football team to a new level with the Athletic FPL podcast, and go further down the English pyramid with the Totally Football League show. So buckle up, as we've got big plans for the new season. Listen to all our shows for free in all the usual places, and ad-free when you subscribe to The Athletic.
Well, we'll look ahead to the football side of things. Everton, game week 2 in just a bit. First of all, we are back at Elland Road, all of us properly, for the first time since the Huddersfield game. And a lot's changed. The status of the team, now a division higher. We have a different set of anxieties. Now it's about staying in the Premier League rather than trying to get into it. Plenty of other stuff going on around the stadium as well.
Yeah, the first thing you'll notice is a beautiful new pitch, and it might not look so different to what you saw second half of last season, certainly when it was first laid. But it has been a complete reconstruction, as was originally supposed to happen last summer, but obviously COVID changed things, and has happened this summer for about £2 million investment. It's not cheap, but it needed to be done. The old drainage was so old and so defunct that it just wasn't working properly and was causing massive problems, as you remember, around about Christmas last year. I was on an Everton podcast yesterday, and I was joking with them that they must be royalty, Everton, because every time they come, they get a new pitch to play on. But it's them again. You'll notice as well, people will see that in the West Stand car park, there's a double-storey porta cabin, which looks like it's going to be the changing rooms for the away players, because the away players were in Howard's restaurant when COVID first shut down. They were using areas in the West Stand to manage that and to keep the squads apart and to maintain COVID bubbles. But Howard's is directly underneath the away end, and you cannot have the players kind of spilling out through the steps there onto the pitch. So there is going to have to be there has been some rearrangement, basically making use of whatever space you can. And for the time being, rather than nice changing rooms, it will be porta cabins.
I think we should send them through the crowd out onto the pitch. Just see how that works out.
It's one way to do it, yeah. I mean, they would have been going through the away end, so it could have been worse. But from the position in the West Stand, there's a little entrance just to the right of the media entrance where you can sneak in and get yourself into the tunnel and straight out onto the pitch. No new dugouts yet, which again we were expecting, but there is work to be done round about them. And the thing for clubs at the moment is that there's so much to manage with COVID that certain things that are prerequisites for the Premier League are having to get dispensation for and having to be kind of put on hold, because you cannot do everything and you can't get everything done. And a lot of what they are having to organise, like porta cabins in the West Stand car park, are just not what you would be doing in a conventional summer. But in terms of the stadium itself, it doesn't look much different. It'll be very, very familiar once you get back in there. It'll be very, very familiar in terms of noise once the crowd get going. And certainly the guys on the presenter on the Everton podcast was saying to me he expects the first 20 minutes to be absolutely bonkers.
It should be good, shouldn't it? The porta cabins, just thinking about that, it's a bit like a school match or something like that, isn't it? Getting changed in porta cabins.
It's a step away from getting changed in the car.
Yeah, in your pants in the car park. We should say that we spoke to the match commander of the police as well just before we started recording this today, and he just did say that there are going to be new routes into the ground as well. Like there's going to be restricted access to the West Stand car park because of they've got new fences, new gates. So if you are in the West Stand, to allow more time to get there, because it might take you a bit longer to walk around either at the Kop end or go all the way around the stadium via the East Stand.
Well, the thing you have to remember is that even though masks will be optional on Saturday, and I wasn't aware of that many people wearing them at Old Trafford last weekend. I got a taxi into the stadium, and the pubs up on Trafford Way or whatever it's called were absolutely mobbed. I mean, people queuing out the door. I had a glance through one of the windows and really, really packed out. And it felt very much as if everybody had just been they'd heard the starting gun and kind of gone back to normal. And it did feel like being back in a normal football stadium. But alongside that, the players and coaches and so on are still in COVID bubbles. They're still guarding as best they can against COVID infections, because it still has big implications for the health of players, obviously, but the team selection as well. It is compromising some managers and has done in the first few weeks of the season. So there's still a lot of management to be done. We are, I think, touch wood, creeping back now towards normal service and normal business resuming. But it will, I think, be a while. Like, for example, we're still on Zoom with press conferences. We still haven't been to Thorpe Arch for a press conference since March 2020, so March of last year. There will still be some restrictions in place, but particularly to protect them.
And some differences for fans too, moving towards a cashless setup at the stadium. So there'll be touch screens and all sorts of crazy technology being...
Well, you tell me if that's a good thing.
I mean, when I heard there were touch screens, I've been in those Kop toilets. I know how many people wash their hands. it just did make me think, I'll maybe wait till I get home to eat.
That is the thing, as people are moving towards less cash, it is forcing everything onto touchscreens, isn't it? Which, given that that's how things get transmitted,
there's going to be a lot of DNA on those touchscreens.
You cannot win, really, can you?
No. So take your hand sanitizer with you. And of course, the away fans, they've got that compound as well. So there's been a compound built for the the Sky trucks, which basically it's semi-permanent, isn't it?
That's right.
So they just drive in, leave them there, and set up, and away they go. But the away fans' compound is next to it, and there's that almost like concrete prison style
gulag,
prison style walkway from the let me figure it out. It's the northwest corner down to the away end.
That's right. Yeah. It's that's where the sports hub was supposed to go on Fullerton Park, and clearly they're moving that over to the Matthew Murray site now that the new training ground isn't going to go at Matthew Murray. So it has left a load of space there for car parking in the potholes, which has always been a game of fun and games for about 15 years, or as long as I've written about the club. But there is space in there for away coaches, and like you say, Sky trucks, which are never far away from Elland Road. So
will you get to experience the fancy new media facilities then for the first time?
I honestly don't know. I would imagine that we'll be able to use the media facilities pre and post match, but in terms of press conference, I would assume it will still be done on Zoom. It was done on Zoom at Old Trafford last weekend for both Solskjaer and Bielsa, and as I say, they're still in these bubbles, so they do have to be careful. But there was some nice food in Manchester. There was, so hoping for a good standard at Leeds.
It's all gilded trays of canapes and smoked salmon and things like that. Is that what it is?
It was cooked breakfast. There was smoked salmon. There was a cheese board of sorts as well. I was quite impressed.
You sicken me.
Presumably, you're not going to be driving in, so it'll be the training, will it, for you at the weekend?
Yeah, I'm banned from driving until November.
Explain why.
I've said this before, but I should explain. Due to brain operation rather than flying down the M1 at 120 miles an hour. But so yes, it'll be the training for me, and then taxi or the bus.
Cans on the train then, no doubt.
Yeah, why not?
And there's always that different feeling about the opening day of the season, isn't it? I know it's not the opening day, but it's the first home game. It's weird, isn't it? And we were talking before about the data set and the lack of other stuff to kind of form your opinion. It's very much a clean slate, isn't it? Apart from the pasting last week, which we don't want to talk about ever again. But that sort of general warmth in the air and lots of shirt sleeves, lots of new replica shirts. And it reminds me very much of, like, Stoke was like that. Do you remember Bielsa's first game? My mental impression of that now is just a sea of white replica shirts and sunshine.
It should be warmer. It is worth saying. It's definitely not got that first season back kind of vibe at the moment. It feels very much like you probably want to take a jumper with you. I
was just going to say, the sun needs to come out. It needs to be that scorching first weekend. It wasn't particularly nice at Old Trafford either. But seasons always go in kind of flows of stamina and fatigue and emotion. You have periods of the season where you can tell that everybody's a bit worn out by it, flagging slightly. You quite often feel this February, March time, particularly if the season's in order and everything else, or as it was at Leeds for a long time, particularly if it's a kind of, lazy cruise to a championship mid-table finish. There was always that kind of dip in intensity. But the first day should be blinding. And I mean, I've been to Old Trafford many times, and the atmosphere has been absolutely nothing to record, but I did think it was very good on Saturday. I did think you could tell that people had been gagging for that for a long time.
And it should be similar, as you're saying, if the Everton fans are expecting a raucous first 20 minutes, it's going to be the first time a lot of our players will have experienced that. I know, again, going back to the West Brom game, we had a small crowd in for that who made a great deal of noise, and well done to them, but this is going to be different gravy.
But the West Brom game, there was nothing riding on it at all, was there? It was a farewell for Berardi and Hernandez and Alioski, as it turned out as well. But West Brom were already relegated. Leeds were already finishing top half. It was just one of those days where you were able to go there and enjoy it. This is much more live and will be much more electric. And you're right, for some of the players like Rafinha, for example, and others, this will be their first taste of what Elland Road is like, for better or for worse. If it goes well on Saturday, they will love it. If it goes badly on Saturday, they will find out as well.
Just check the weather forecast. 21 degrees and raining on Saturday.
Marvellous.
In Leeds, which should be warm and muggy, but we'll see how we get on with that. Just thinking about that Stoke game, actually, and sitting here 3 years on, did you imagine when we got into the stadium that day that 3 years on we'd be sitting with Marcelo Bielsa, still our manager in the Premier League? Because in my mind, I thought, well, he'll be here for 3-6 months, a season if we're lucky.
I think that game changed things, though, didn't it? Because I think it was one of those things that, because of the way he is, you thought, well, his methods are going to take quite a while to get over to the players, and if we have a bad start, if we're kind of lurking around 17th or something, they might decide, well, actually, this isn't working in the Championship, it's not going to be an option. But we were so quickly out of the blocks, and that Stoke game is probably one of my favourite ever Leeds games just for the pure shock and joy of it, because they were favourites to go up that season, weren't they? They'd just come down. They had on paper a really, really strong squad, and we just came out and absolutely blew them away in it, and it more or less continued. I know that season obviously ultimately ended with the disappointment, but it's more or less been a continuation of that game with some fairly notable blips along the way.
I can't for the life of me remember exactly what I expected before that game, but I do remember that in that summer, people had very much invested in the idea that Bielsa could be really special. The only fly in the ointment was the history of coaches coming to Leeds and being hopeless and, going in no time, it all falling apart. And even the flashes of promise like you had under Christensen initially, fading into nothing and a very, very quick sacking. And, there was the game with Christensen, the 5-0 against Burton at home, where a lot of people thought, do you know what? Like, looking like a very, very good side. But it didn't feel conclusive in the way that the Stoke game did. And I remember expecting in that game for Bielsa to be very kind of flamboyant on the touchline, very kind of active. And we sat the duration of the first half and just watched him sit on his stool, doing very little and reacting very little and looking so calm. I always remember speaking to Paul Warren at Rotherham and him saying, Bielsa's really intimidating on that stool, because you feel like you're on your feet and you're bouncing about and you're shouting at people. He spends long periods where he says nothing and does nothing. And it's as if, his work's done through the week and he's the calmest person in the building. But at the end of that Stoke game, I bumped into one of the stewards, Al, who I've known for years and have seen there for years. And he's very perceptive and he knows his football, and he can spot the difference between good performance, bad performance, and also spot the difference between a period of form which is a problem and a period of form which is just a kind of standard dip. And I saw him, and I kind of mentioned this in the introduction to my book, and I don't want to be subliminal here with by the book, so I am sorry, but I saw him and he just said to me, Jesus, that is next level. That it's, we've even like Burton last season where they won 5-0. That today is completely different. The pace of it and the aggression of it and the intricacy of it and the way they were able to piece it together without, with such kind of confidence. He said that is, that looks like a real statement, that, and it was.
I remember sort of post-Wilkinson Championship era always just longing for a Leeds United side that knocked the ball around and were brilliant and looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. Every single member of the team looked like they knew what they were doing, because there was always kind of those loose random elements around Leeds sides not quite knowing who goes where, or maybe how does that signing fit in. You think about with the sign Brolin on a bit of a whim. Why did we really buy Lee Sharp? Did we need him? Was he ever up to start? And then suddenly it clicked, and I saw before me in that first half against Stoke the thing that I'd wanted for decades right in front of my eyes. And it took me till half time when the whistle went to kind of catch my breath and go, oh my God, we're amazing.
I think that was the thing at half time. I remember there being almost a confusion, everyone going, well, this is good, isn't it? This is really good, because we'd come off the back of the Heckingbottom season with the same players, and then you were like, is something going wrong with Stoke? Like, are they all drugged or something? Because we look like we could win this by about 5-0 here. It's just so bizarre.
Don't forget as well that it was Stoke, and I know they were not good in that season, but they had been forking out for Afobe and Ince, and they'd spent quite a lot of money getting Rowett from Derby. They were favourites for the title by quite a distance, in the way that it always is in the Championship. Maybe it's changing a bit now, but when you spend a lot of money, automatically you hit the top of the odds. But they were heavily fancied, and at no stage in that game, even when Afobe scored that penalty, at no stage did it tip to a point where you felt like Stoke were wading forward and they were going to get a draw or more. As soon as they scored, it just kind of reset, and as well, the impressive way that Bielsa started to reel in players who felt like they were kind of drifting away from Leeds. Cleek scoring the opening goal, you thought, we've never seen that from him. Not really. And didn't really know that he had that in him, because Christensen had just bombed him out completely. You'd had the odd League Cup game where, he'd shown a bit, but it wasn't kind of that obvious. You had Phillips, who was at the stage of his career where he kind of needed direction and needed to start making a bigger impact, and suddenly he was in this role that seemed to suit him so nicely. Saez, who'd hardly, scratched the surface since his spitting ban, and you weren't really sure what was going on with him. Was he going to stay? Was he going to go? Was he part of the furniture? And obviously he did leave, and I often wondered whether he was really made long term for a Bielsa system. But again, just the harmony between him and Cleek and players out wide and everything else, and Roof up front. It was Roof, not Bamford. It's £7 million signing. It was Roof that he went for. It was absolutely majestic, and like Michael says, it's one of the most enjoyable games I've sat and watched.
It does feel like, Derby apart, we never really looked back from that point. We've made progress non-stop since that game kicked off. And last time we were all in there together was Huddersfield at home. Can you recall what that day was like?
It was immense because it was that Elland goal at the start. And I don't think I can ever remember such a feeling of confidence around Elland Road. Not in the Championship. That feeling that it was definitely, even when I was tweeting stupid things like "this is nailed on, that's nailed on." I don't think I've ever seen the crowd looking as if they felt like promotion was in the bag, and it did feel like that on that afternoon. I've spoken before about the fact that Hunter was there. Norman Hunter was the last time any of us saw Norman up in the gantry, and it was just a procession. Huddersfield didn't get close to Leeds. It wasn't a procession in terms of the scoreline. It was reasonably close at 2-0, but it wasn't close in terms of the contest. And that was 5 wins on the bounce. That was 5 games without scoring a goal, without conceding a goal. Sorry. I thought that at that point it was top 2 finish all the way, and that was one of the big concerns about the COVID shutdown. Was it felt like it was potentially pulling the rug out of everything right at the stage where it felt as if they'd got it licked.
We should set up a debate between you and Karen Carney, because I think she disagrees with that point, doesn't she?
I don't think she does disagree with that point. I suspect when she looks back, she will probably wish she hadn't bothered saying what she said.
Looking forward to it then at the weekend.
Yeah, of course. Been waiting for this for ages. It's going to be strange. I think it is going to be strange, and it is going to be emotional. I think I can't wait for that bit of just walking out and seeing the pitch, which is like, I feel like you get it always to an extent on the first day of the season, but I feel like more than ever I'm going back to my childhood again, and that feeling of like almost like the Champions League nights where you used to step out there and you'd be like, this feels a little bit different, and it will feel different for being a Premier League game as well, and knowing that it is, because it has been such a long time. I was practically a kid last time. I was a teenager the last time I saw a Leeds Premier League game. I think maybe early 20s. Anyway, I felt young. It feels like a whole lifetime ago, and it feels like a lifetime ago since that Huddersfield game as well. And we are a different club now. We've transformed, as long as we don't go down this season, which I have to I always tag that caveat on. But it feels like we are a completely different club in many respects to that Huddersfield game. So it's going to be it's going to be amazing. I can't wait.
In part 2 there, we touched on Norman Hunter, Phil, and do we have an idea yet about how we're going to commemorate the people we've lost? Presumably there's going to be either applause or silence or something along those lines.
I would imagine that there will be a minute's applause beforehand, if not a minute's silence. Minute's applause is always strike me these days as being a bit more sensible than minute's silence, because you can't always trust that the latter will go off smoothly. But I would be amazed if they don't do something of that sort. In terms of longer term things, I mean, obviously they have named the East Stand after Jack Charlton and the South Stand after Norman Hunter, and that those sort of processes will doubtless continue. But yeah, I think not only for them, but it will be everybody who's gone in the interim, because there'll be a lot of supporters who go back for this game on Saturday without people that they would have gone with previously, because of what's happened in the 18 months. So yeah, a lot to dwell on.
And down to brass tacks and the football side of things against Everton. What can we expect from Leeds? What can we expect from Everton? Start with Leeds first of all. Will we see the necessary changes to the lineup, or that's the changes that people would deem necessary?
Bielsa said that with Phillips, he's had a week's training, additional week's training, obviously after Old Trafford, so he is closer, but he didn't commit to whether or not he'll start the game. It looks like Llorente will not be back until next week with this muscle strain. I thought he was missed as well at Old Trafford. It did feel towards the back end of last season like he had become the best centre-back in the team, and it did look a little bit on Saturday like the best centre-back in the team wasn't on the pitch. So I don't expect him to be there, but obviously if Phillips comes into the central defensive midfield role, it could well be Koch that partners Liam Cooper, or he also might stick with Strike and Cooper, two lefties at the back. I don't think beyond that there will be vast number of changes, but I am wondering what he'll do with Rodrigo and the midfield. At half-time at Old Trafford, he switched to Dallas and Cleek, and I felt in the circumstances, even though it patently didn't work, I did feel like it it seemed like the right move at the right time, just to kind of tighten things up in there. So if Firpo is fit to start and he played the second half last weekend, there might well be that temptation to play Dallas and Click together. The sort of combination of 8s that I sometimes feel Bielsa prefers, as opposed to an 8 and an out-and-out 10, if that's what we can call Rodrigo. But there will be part of him that will be thinking, a big part of him will be thinking, get on the front foot in this and really dominate, be aggressive, be attacking. And perhaps to that end, it will be Rodrigo who gets the nod.
We do look so much more solid, though, when we've got a proper lefty at left back and then Dallas is in midfield. We certainly did towards the back end of last season.
I think Dallas not being in midfield is to the detriment of the team. He's a good left back and he's decent there, but I think putting him there reduces some of what you get from him when he's further up the pitch. I always feel like that midfield partnership is the biggest area of debate at the moment. What would be best? What the best balance is? It seems to me more and more that there are some games where a Cleek Dallas partnership would suit more than a Dallas Rodrigo or a Cleek Rodrigo. But there will be games where you do want Rodrigo in there because Leeds football is all about being aggressive, dominating possession, dictating the flow of the game. That didn't happen at Old Trafford, which is why I think Rodrigo wasn't much of an asset on the day over there. But yeah, there can't be any doubt that having Firpo at left back and the little bits that he did at Old Trafford, the overlap and the underlap and the interceptions, they were good little signs without in any way being able to say that was a quality performance, because the second half was abysmal from Leeds. But he should make a difference there.
Who drops out then? If you're going to retain Rodrigo and put Firpo in, push Dallas into midfield, is it Click who goes?
I think Dallas plays ahead of Click. I think he does at the moment. But I do think there is an argument for the two of them in that midfield zone. I think it will be horses for courses with Bielsa, but at home, I don't see him wanting to be overly negative.
Do you suspect that Everton will be a little bit more on the back foot because they're certainly not as talented as Man United?
Our Everton writer Paddy Boylan's been writing about this, and if you're interested in them, it's worth a read about the shift in tactics with Benitez, going to a much more direct style. You won't see anywhere near as much passing of the ball or intricate passing moves, I don't think, as you did with Ancelotti. But one of the things that stood out with Everton, they had a hard first half against Southampton, but in the second half, Richarlison was very good and very dangerous. And it was funny because I was watching him during the game at Elland Road last season, and Everton won that game, but he had a weird night. He seemed as if from the start, his effort levels were pretty low, and as if he was waiting to be substituted, just waiting, to get through enough minutes to the point where Ancelotti would say, right, your night's done and off you come. But he's played a lot through the summer. He looks very, very fit, and yeah, sharp. I think he is definitely somebody to watch.
And in terms of Brazilians, we have our own slightly moody at the weekend Brazilian in Rafinha. Hopefully we see, what's the right word I'm going to pick here, focused performance from him, because it feels like with Rafinha, when he's good, he's brilliant, he's amazing, he's unstoppable. But when it starts to get away from him a little bit, or the game gets away from Leeds, he starts to become a little bit loose and sloppy.
To find out a bit about him, I'd suggest that people go back and read the piece I did with Jack Lang about his background in Brazil, and he's kind of always been quite a fiery character. They spoke about how if somebody played a bad ball to him, he would just catch it and take a yellow card because he was that unhappy with the way it had been played. He was somebody who just couldn't really bring himself to lose games or to be poor. I think he's got that definite competitive edge in him. But he is one of the players who, when he plays well, Leeds are going to play well. No doubt about that. It just that I don't know what it was at Old Trafford, but absolutely nothing was working for him there. Everything he tried, everything he did, it just wasn't quite coming off, despite there being situations where he could have caused a bit of trouble for them at the back. But still, to my mind, the player in the squad with the most showbiz.
Do you think Leeds at Old Trafford played the occasion again a little bit? Did they get caught up in that or not?
I could only say that for the period after Ayling scored. I didn't feel in the first half that they played especially well, but I didn't, that thing about winning your battles one-on-one and so on, it didn't happen and it didn't work as well as it can under Bielsa. I don't think that was because of the occasion, but I do, to repeat myself here, I do wonder if that Ayling goal, the way it was scored, the kind of moment, the rush of it, whether they got too caught up in that and suddenly, boom, it's 3-1 and the game was gone. It was, like Michael said, it was kind of extraordinary the way it went from, the game, it's suddenly being game on to being game over in no time at all. And I was the same. There was a period, up until about the 70th minute where I did wonder if it was going to end up being 6, 7, 8.
And I started responding to texts that I got about Ayling's goal. Like, whoa, look at that, to my mates. And by the time I'd finished replying to them, we were 3-1 behind.
Yeah.
Which just goes to show how quickly it turned around. Well, the question that flows from my previous one is then, will Leeds play the game and not the occasion this weekend at Elland Road, particularly if it is going to be raucous in that first half, which it's going to be heightened emotions, it's going to be loud, it's going to be something to behold, but will it distract the players at all?
I was asking Bielsa about the difference the crowd's going to make, because there was a lot of conversation about how minus crowds, the significance of being at home had been altered. It was no longer a massive advantage, and it no longer made a huge difference. I definitely felt that the crowd at Old Trafford made a difference in that period where they were laying it on heavily and scoring rapidly. I did think that it helped to make Leeds wobble. Bielsa, I think Bielsa sees that as a bit of a cop-out, and the idea that if he was saying, the crowd helped there, he'd be deflecting from the deficiencies of the team or his errors as a coach. And he said, I don't think our performance is affected by what the crowd do. But I think, and so on that basis, I don't think they should play the occasion on Saturday, and I don't think they will. But there's always the risk of that, and particularly on a day like this, because I have to say, being in Old Trafford, it was like being in a different universe, because you'd just completely forgotten what that was like. Not just having 8,000 back in the stands, but having 75,000. It is just a completely different experience.
And no doubt a warm welcome for former Leeds United favourite Andros Townsend at the weekend. He's going to welcome back Andros.
Yeah, the surprise they haven't done a hashtag Ask Andros this week, because they've gone so well in the past. They've
had a slightly strange window so far of Everton in the people that they've signed. And Damari Gray and Townsend, you look at it and you go, ugh.
And the big debate over there is whether or not there is now any place in the squad for James Rodriguez. And I think there are some people who feel that there probably isn't, with the way Benitez is going to work. Is a player like that, despite his reputation and his immense talent, is he actually needed? Is he even going to feature on Saturday? It's difficult to tell. But then Everton have just had a funny run of things, full stop. They don't seem to be able to, despite the money they spend, and they are spending a lot, they don't seem to be able to find a groove that keeps them going for any length of time. And I know they lost Ancelotti in fairly, unfortunate circumstances. The Real Madrid job came up, he wanted to go, and so he left. The difficulty with Benitez there is that it has to go very, very well for Benitez. Otherwise, what's going to be dragged out very quickly.
Yeah. When it comes to Rodriguez, it felt like he was a passenger in the game at Goodison last year, and we essentially bypassed him out of the game, because he wasn't working hard, he wasn't tracking back, which allowed Phillips all that space to start dictating the game.
Phillips was absolutely brilliant in that game, and Cleek was terrific as well. They dealt very well with the front three. Calvert-Lewin through the middle, who can be really dangerous, and particularly in circumstances that Leeds aren't always great in, which is defending set pieces, although they did get much better at that. But that was how he scored in the second game at Elland Road, and he's so strong in the air that even if you're defending set pieces fairly well, he's somebody that can cause you grief. Basically be considerably better at the back, which is something Bielsa said himself after Old Trafford. But I think be more assertive on the ball. That's what Leeds are best at, and that's when they're very, very good. That's what they need to do.
There were some nice moments actually in that first half. Going back to Rodrigo, where there was that little interplay. Do you remember it with, I think Rafinha was involved, Rodrigo, and you thought, oh, we're up for this. And then obviously, with the passage of the game, that sort of stuff fades into memory. But we did show little glimpses there of things being all right.
And they were always at risk of getting ambushed by Pogba having a blinder of a day. I mean, he's come up with 4 assists, which is probably going to be the most anybody gets in a single game at any stage of this season. And I don't know, it seems to me that Pogba is going to be sort of permanently misunderstood in England. It seems to be this hard journey for him to get to the point where people accept that he is this blinding player who's won the World Cup with France. But seeing him playing like that on on Saturday, he would have got into any team in the world.
If he didn't have that bit of
form,
without that bit of blue in his hair, he'd have got 5 assists.
Maybe that's all the difference. Yeah.
Graham Souness. What sort of game do we see? Because with the greatest respect to Everton, they don't have the midfield that Manchester United have. You look at the players like Fernandes and Pogba. Not a bad pair of players, if we can, forgive their choice of football team. But Everton are not blessed with the same resources, are they? So should it be? I don't want to use the phrase an easier contest, but should it be more manageable from a Leeds perspective?
I think it should be, although I was saying to the guys on the Everton podcast, I find this incredibly difficult to call because having read about and looked at the changes under Benitez, I'm honestly not sure how their style is going to marry up against Leeds. My assumption would be that their style will probably lend itself to Leeds dominating more possession again and having a lot of the game. But it's really difficult to tell. I think if Ancelotti's Everton were coming here, having seen them twice last season, you'd have far more idea of what was going to go on and where the kind of key battles were going to be. But I mean, for example, Richarlison was a handful against Southampton. But if you can cut the supply to him, and if the supply is dependent on going more direct, then perhaps that becomes easier for Leeds. Then he's not going to have the same impact. So to say I can't call this would be a massive understatement. I really have no idea what's going to go on Saturday.
What sort of style do Everton play then? You're talking about direct football. Does a lot of it go down the wings? Because we spoke earlier in the week on the Square Ball podcast, our mate Moscow was saying that they cross a lot. They're a team that crosses a lot. Now, we play a lot of our game out wide. So can we hopefully cut off that supply, as you were saying, and stifle them out wide?
I think that's what Leeds will try to do, but they'll try to do it mostly by dominating the ball rather than specifically positioning themselves to stop Everton attacks. But I think if you've got Phillips in the team, that's one of the things that he does really, really well, is cover the spaces out wide when the fullbacks bomb on. They will look for crossing opportunities. That was a lot of what was going on at Goodison against Southampton. But what you won't see, I think Paddy Moylan said that there was only one exchange of passes that went beyond 10, I think, against Southampton. So you're not going to see the kind of really intricate. For example, when I watched back the Bilbao game at Old Trafford when Bielsa took them in 2012, they had a period straight after the opening goal from Rooney where they just strung together 35 passes on the edge of the Manchester United box. I don't think you're going to see any of that with Benitez, or not a great deal. So it will be more direct, and they probably will play the percentages more. I think Bielsa's hope will be that Leeds have so much of the ball and so much territory that they're able to make the game theirs.
Is there a danger, do you think, Michael, with us having a lot of the ball, that if we don't score, people start to get nervous and on the players' backs if we can't make that breakthrough, or it feels like possession is not being used in a threatening manner?
At Elland Road? Surely not. My fantasy for this game is that it's a bit like the West Brom game where Pablo scored early, because going into it, it feels like, as Phil was saying, two pretty evenly matched teams. Like it could go either way, and it was the same on that night, but we got off to such a good start and then completely steamrolled them. My fantasy really is that we get a nice early lead and we can just go through the songbook and kind of make up for a bit of lost time in the stadium, because it feels like that needs to happen. And if we're 2-0 down, it's going to be quite hard to enjoy it as much as you're going, I should be enjoying this because I'm back here and I've wanted it for so long. But then there'll be also a bit of you thinking, I might get off.
Honestly, second game of the season, he's already thinking, I'll get back to the car, get away from this misery.
I'm sick of this.
Richarlison hat-trick, 33-1. Yeah.
I'm positive about this game. I think Leeds are more than capable of taking this one by the scruff of the neck and coming out.
You were trying to blame me for the Old Trafford result last weekend, and I think Michael will.
This was via text.
I don't want to speak for Michael, but I suspect he will agree with me here that there was only one person in this room who was predicting victory on the grass of Manchester.
I just suggested that Phil, if he'd been more positive, maybe things would have worked out a little bit better. He should have got behind the lads, and it would have driven us on to victory.
Get behind the team.
Yeah, exactly. Your negativity put the wind in Paul Pogba's sails, and he kept doing really good passes to Bruno Fernandes, which I didn't like at all. But no, we've got every reason to be positive about this, haven't we? Let's ignore last week. It feels like we did the bloodletting in part one of this show, and there's been a lot of it across the week. Clean slate for the weekend, back in Elland Road. It's going to be absolutely bouncing. What's not to look forward to?
That is definitely right. And I always feel at the start of the season, I know this is hard to make this argument, but you do need to be 6, 7, 8 games in to get a proper feel for how it's going. I don't think that at Old Trafford gives you a proper feel necessarily any more than a good result would have done over there. But there are things that went on at Old Trafford that they cannot repeat. over and over again. Otherwise, bad results will come. This should be absolutely terrific. And although the crowd's back, and you're talking about playing the occasion, they've never actually found that a problem at Elland Road under Bielsa, with the exception of the Derby game. And I still feel that the Derby game all turned on that mistake.
Wigan. What about Wigan?
No, it was tense, was Wigan.
Do you know what? Yeah.
Wigan was tense. It wasn't bouncing, was it?
Yeah,
but it was...
I'll just go into reverse gear here. Yeah, that would jump out to me more than the Derby game, really, because Derby felt as if the error between Cooper and Casilla, the mix up there, just undermined everything.
It was like pulling the plug out of the bath.
It
wasn't
really
it?
was, and down it went. And then before you know it, Mason Mount was scoring, and you sit in the press box going, "You have to be joking! Like, how is this happening?" Wigan is number one, the weirdest game I have ever seen. Wigan, I still do not understand how they managed to lose that from 1-0 up against 10 players against a side who were basically, we're mixing it heavily with relegation.
Ended on a positive.
Yes, but that was then. This is now.
Well, yeah,
onwards.
let's add that into our perspective. And look at how good things are now. And it's so true, but we look back on those games, and we were talking about the Stoke game earlier on, and a decade and a half's worth of anxiety weighing on our shoulders as we went into this new season with a new manager, hoping beyond hope that finally we get it right, and this is the one that clicks. And it did click. It just ended badly. We just didn't quite get there at the end of that season. But then the season after, obviously going up, winning the league at a canter in the end, was amazing, and we've not stopped since, to return to a point that I made earlier. So let's go into this full of heart and full of vim and vigour.
Absolutely, you can see it with hindsight as a 2-year project in the Championship, even though that wasn't the initial intention. And it might well be that because they had 2 years there, they were better prepared for the Premier League last season, and hence one of the reasons they were able to finish 9th. And it should be, if football follows some sort of logical process, it should be that 3 years of that under Bielsa mean that they are well set for this season and they should be able to cope. I did say last week that I think a better season this time round, so an improvement on 9th, is a challenge, and I'm not convinced it's going to figure out that way, but I still think with him and the players, they have enough to have a steady year.
Are we normal when it comes to football fans? Because we've got nothing to measure it against. I do wonder if our expectations are higher than those of fans of other clubs. We certainly are for some clubs, because some have got no ambition beyond staying in the Premier League. So that's very much the case. But I mean, just in the general sort of top half of the Premier League.
You're bound to be, to an extent. It's hard to kind of preach realism, because what is realism after all? Like, what is reasonable ambition at this stage? If I say another mid-table finish is good for the club, somebody else might say, well, yeah, but I don't buy a season ticket to just kind of canter into mid-table again. I always want more, and I always want to be ambitious, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I think you just have to try and pitch your expectations at a level which is actually attainable. And for a team who've just got promoted second time round, there's only so much that you can ask of them. That is not the same as saying that if you thought before today that they need another centre mid, that you're wrong. I totally agree with that, and the proof is going to be in the pudding with this. But do you expect too much? Does anybody expect too much? I mean, even at Old Trafford, you spend a lot of money, you do okay, you get to the Europa League final. It's never enough, is it? Second place in the Premier League.
No, it's true. And even though they've spent an inordinate amount of money this summer, they're still going to be unhappy if things don't go top 2, 3 this season and make progress in Europe. So I guess we always want for more, don't we, as football fans, regardless of whether you're them lot or us lot.
But sometimes you're entitled to ask for more. So if at Manchester United you've gone several years without a trophy, then you're entitled to be ambitious for one, to have the ambition.
You're just
of that.
entitled. You should have just stopped that.
If you are Leeds in the Championship or League One for 16 seasons, then I think you are entitled to promotion. It doesn't just happen, but I think you are entitled to sit and say, we want better than this. There's no problem with that. When you finish 9th in the Premier League, I'm not quite sure what, on the immediate season after that, I'm not quite sure what the right target is. I've been two minds about that all the way through the summer, and quite honestly, I'm still not sure.
Do you think that the ownership of the club maybe made a misstep in identifying the short to medium term goal as like Europa League places? Because we finished 9th, the immediate thought then goes to, well, 8th or 7th is where we need to be next season to get towards that goal, because we actually only missed out on a European spot by fault of, well, how the league panned out in terms of the points spread. You know, in other years, our points total would have got us about 7th in most years, and European football immediately. So do you think by setting that goal, they've almost made a bit of a rod for their own back, in much the same way that by splashing the cash last summer, they're now telling us, well, we need to be a bit more sensible this summer?
If I've remembered this incorrectly, then I apologise in advance. But I think I'm right in saying that when he was asked about this back in January, Radrizzani was talking about 3 to 5 years for Europa League. He was kind of saying that I want to stick around until we get into Europe, and I know that's true of Victor Orta as well. He's always said that he'll stay here until the day, hopefully, when Leeds do find their way into Europe. So 3 to 5 years seems to me to be, that seems like a realistic timescale if you're prepared to build and build and build and to do it steadily. I don't think they would ever have said that they expected to come up, finish 9th, and then qualify for Europe the following year. I think if it happens, you gladly accept it, and it's a feather in your cap. But it does seem to me to be, unless you have a lot of money to spend, it seems to me to be something that's probably not going to happen very often.
And the final point then, to wrap it up and to finish on a positive note as well, is that if we win on Saturday, when we sit here next week, the conversation will be completely different, because all those anxieties will have fallen away and we'll be like, everything's okay.
Yep, and let's hope for that, is all I can say.
And then a disastrous loss to Crewe midweek.
Yeah, but it's only the League Cup.
Go on then, predictions for this one. Everton at home.
Tough game, but I think Leeds will edge it.
1-0?
2-1.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
What are you going to say?
2-1.
Both saying 2-1. I said on the Square Ball podcast, I think this is a 2-0 or a 3-1 for Leeds, so I will stick with that for the sake of consistency. I should have changed my mind, shouldn't I? Actually, I covered as many bases as possible, but here we are. We'll find out next week, won't we? And fingers crossed it all goes to plan. And sign up for The Athletic for the new season if you haven't yet. That discount 33% at theathletic.com/LeedsPod. Give us a wave on Twitter as well, at The Phil Hay Show, and we'll speak to you next week.